Hello, this is Austin Bauk. I'm the owner at furfarmandfork.com, and I'm starting a new web series called Excelling at Food Safety. We're going to go through some of my tips and tricks for creating Excel databases for managing your food safety management systems. And we're going to talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages of using Excel versus a third-party software solution and things like that. And today we're going to start out with some basic principles that let us use some of the tools I'm going to show as we go through individual elements. And so we're going to talk about file housekeeping and database building and just a little bit about why we would use Excel to manage our food safety system. So a lot of times when folks are expressing frustration, they'll say things like, my company just runs off a spreadsheet and it's ridiculous because we've reached a certain size or we have a certain amount of people involved, things like that. And what folks are really saying when they say this is that their company doesn't manage information well. The fact that it happens to be a spreadsheet is irrelevant. They're expressing frustrations about the way information is shared and the way we can use information and ask questions about what our company is currently doing. So if we can access that information, make it available, the medium in which we do it doesn't really matter. Key thing is that software solutions that are saying that they will change the way your food safety system goes and things like that, they aren't going to change the way management actually handles that information. They're just going to change the way in which it's presented. And you ultimately get out of software what you put into it. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So third-party software solutions, they're like 80% of the booths at conferences now and things like that. Our new food safety system of some kind is here, and they basically say, some real advantages are that the interfaces are really user-friendly. We have lots of drop-down boxes and restricted entry fields and things like that that make it easy for users to use. They do have simultaneously access from multiple computers, which is very important as your department gets bigger. They do permissions management, so you can give limited access to folks who just need to do data entry versus folks who are creating systems and things like that. They have a lot of built-in report generating, which is typically what they're showing in terms of making your system more audit-friendly. And it's evidence of management commitment when you're in the midst of an audit and you can say, oh, well, we spent this money on this system to make sure that we're managing our system. Versus they're telling you that you need our system, not Excel, because you need to create your own reports in Excel, and I mean, who can do that, right? The spreadsheets look gross. They look like handwritten notes, like somebody kind of slapped something together. Excel files have only single user access unless you're getting into Office 365, in which case it's starting to act more like Google Sheets or one of these solutions where multiple people can edit simultaneously. Generally, with the average license for Excel that your business has, it's going to be someone can edit the file and everyone else has read-only access. And permissions are controlled at IT or by barrier access versus permissions are created in these third-party software solutions. But if I'm talking about using Excel in your business, the first and foremost thing I want to talk about is that you likely have Excel licenses on all the computers currently in your company, right? There's a lot of these other solutions, there's an upfront cost, and then there's a subscription fee, and it's not an insignificant amount of money, especially if you're a smaller company. When at the end of the day, it's going to take the exact same amount of time to input and maintain records as this third-party software. You will still need to create deviation reports. You will still need someone to go in and approve those. You will still need someone to enter in all of your products and maintain a register of all the products you make and their specifications, etc. So the exact same work is going to happen. It's just going to happen on their platform where they've organized and created some rules for you. But if ultimately at the end of the day you're not going to save man hours, then those software dollars are spent without a return. If we're using Excel, our employees are going to learn software that can be used for other purposes in the business, and we're teaching a skill instead of a job duty. So if we're investing in our people, right, they're the only thing that's going to appreciate at our company. So we could either teach folks, hey, here's this software that you will never see outside of work or used anywhere else in the company, but if you need to create a deviation report, you need to click on these things, enter these fields, and hit enter, and the system now has it. Whereas if we're teaching people how to interact with Excel spreadsheets, they're learning skills that they can then go, boy, what if I did some trending about the way we're spending hours on our sanitation program or things like that. And so in that way, we're not teaching people how to use a program they'll never see anywhere, but we're actually investing in job skills. And it's been shown that right now Microsoft Excel skills are extremely important for folks who want to move into mid positions, and they're trying to focus on that at the college level and the high school level. So if we're doing it within our own business, we're growing people either for our company, or when they move on, they're going to tell everyone that their company taught them the tricks they did. Excel, despite what we're going to be told by folks selling third-party software, is extremely powerful reporting, analysis, and record keeping, but it can only do so when we have the know-how to do it and when good practices are maintained, which is what we're going to talk about in this presentation. And when we see bad examples of spreadsheets, that's what they are. They're bad examples. We could also use a piece of third-party software and only fill in half the fields or put gibberish in the fields, and it's also not going to provide us with good reports and things like that. So when we see a picture of a spreadsheet that they're like, oh my goodness, this looks unprofessional, well, that's because we made an unprofessional spreadsheet, and we can absolutely make spreadsheets that look more professional. So here's why most Excel-driven systems are ineffective, and it's because we don't have best practices. The real trick about third-party software solutions and the user interfaces that they include is that they force people to follow rules. They don't allow you to submit that deviation report without you having selected a root cause, without you having listed all the people involved, the rooms that were involved, etc. And that's why you can show those beautiful reports that say, hey, look, we know everything about this deviation. We can follow those same rules in Excel, but it does take a little bit of effort on our part. But that's why these systems end up ineffective, is that we build spreadsheets and things like that to manage our system, and we don't follow specific rules. So as a best practice, we need to treat Excel as a programming tool, because in a lot of ways it is. So that means we're going to have controlled file names and locations. Our names are going to follow consistent formatting. Everything's going to happen on a shared network, not a C drive or personal drives or any locked out spaces that other employees can't access. And we're not going to just move files around in the background, because we know that our sheets are going to rely on those files and how they're named. We're going to be using a lot of hyperlinks, we're going to be using a lot of references and things like that, and that requires us to have really good, consistent file naming systems and not moving things around so that those systems don't break. And then we're going to use some barrier security. So that's keeping people from mucking around in things we don't want them to. So we are still going to have different user levels, right? Your SQF practitioner is going to be able to obsolete documents or change our specifications, but our microbiology technician shouldn't. And so in terms of the size of our company, we can use different levels of barrier security. In terms of simple barrier security, it can be as simple as, all right, there's, 6 of us here in the office, and then we have a production floor, right? Nobody on the production floor has a computer or has access to this stuff. In the office, we just need to say, hey, if you're not the SQF practitioner, maybe no one else goes into my SOP folder and moves things around. Like, generally, no one's going to have an interest in doing that. So it can work really well until your company reaches a certain size with a certain amount of access. Designating files as read-only, really, really easy. We just right-click on a file or a folder, and we tell Windows that this is now read-only, and anytime somebody opens it, they won't be able to save over that copy. We can take off the permissions when we're editing. That's a real simple way to put a barrier for mid-level computer users who are going to understand how to check for that. We can use the Office Suite file security features, which I'll point out on some of the documents, but we can lock those out in the file as well. And that can be a single click, or we can include password protections if we want to make it more complicated. But a lot of times, most people won't know those security features even exist, and so that file will be effectively locked out except for the users we want editing it. We can also hide files in network locations staff don't frequent. So similar to the only John can touch policy, we can just have the SQF folder and nobody has any reason to go in the SQF folder or the SOP folder or the quality management folder. Folks who are scheduling trucking aren't going to have any need to go in there, so there's no reason to mess with it. Whereas if we put it in our general operations folder that includes safety deviations and things like that, we potentially have people who are going to look in there. If we want to be really complicated with our barrier security, we can have IT set folder permissions for user access. If we're controlling users really hard in our plant, things like that, that requires somebody on site doing that, just like it would if we had a third-party system creating new users for the third-party system, right? And then, like I mentioned before, we have the Office Suite password protections. So best practices, we want to design our spreadsheets as databases, not matrices or charts. So this is new for a lot of folks, and it's really uncomfortable at first until you get used to it. But databases and tables, where we want to be, they can be analyzed for trending and reporting. They save us time from having to perform individual calculations. They allow for pivot charts and pivot tables. They allow for complex formula tools, but they do require more data entry because we need to provide more information every time we add data so that all of these other things can actually happen. If we're making matrices or charts, which is what we normally see companies using Excel for, they're easy to understand, they're user-friendly in terms of what you're looking at, and the data entry tends to be very limited. But they'll only provide us with one piece of information because we have that limited data entry, and they can't be analyzed without organizing the data. Some analysis tools can be used, and Excel users are going to really be able to hop in and say, oh, hey, I'd love to real quickly, add up this information. And they'll create tables and charts and stuff that'll pull from these charts. But you generally, when you want to ask deep questions about the data, you need to re-enter it all and make a database or table. So let's look at some examples here. So if I was thinking about matrices or charts, this is the kind of thing I would normally find when I'm looking at companies that are using Excel as individuals and folks who are saying, I'm comfortable interacting with cells and creating some simple formulas and things like that. These are the types of registers and charts that are generated. So I say, hey, this is my training register. So I have all of my employees listed on one axis, and I have all my SOPs I trained them on listed on the other axis. And anytime I train an employee on an SOP, I'll put in the date that I trained them. So this is extremely intuitive. You can introduce this to anyone and say, hey, here's where we are on training. Looks like I still need to train Thorin on these 3 SOPs right here. Samwise is almost done. Frodo's almost done. Everyone else is up to date. And then you can go back through it and say, hey, I've now retrained Bilbo on SOP 10-003, so I will go ahead and update that today's date. Oops, it's 2020 now. And say, cool, he's up to date. And this matrix you could do some calculations on, right? We could create some conditional formatting that'll show that anytime one of these is more than a year old, it turns red so that we need to retrain them and things like that. But if we wanted to say, see all the training that I conducted on January 3rd, I kind of got to eyeball through all this and maybe copy and paste it out and things like that and figure out what that looks like. So in terms of a training register, the information at a glance provided here is who's been trained on what and if there's any gaps missing. I've then got to go through and see if any of this stuff is maybe expired and things like that. But anybody could walk in here and say, I did training today. Me and Frodo went over this, we're good to go. So in a lot of ways this is really intuitive, and it's not an unhelpful tool, and certainly it'll work just fine in audit and things like that. But if we were to create this as a database, we'd have more information available to us, and all of this information right here would still be available to us, but we would generate it as a report rather than have it as our data entry point. So when I create tables and databases, I don't start with X and Y axis and thinking about creating a certain point. I like to think of the smallest event that's going to happen and make sure I provide all the information. So let's say anytime I want to record that I've conducted some training, I'm going to start with, well, I'm going to record everything I did that day, right? So let's do training date. And, oops, knocked my mic over there. Let's talk about which SOP we trained upon, sure, and what person maybe that we trained on that SOP. Excellent. So this information is now here, and let's just say I conducted some training today. So I'll do 1520. The SOP will be 10-01, and the employee will be Frodo Baggins. I can select this table by clicking and dragging, or I can do Control A, and we're going to use Excel's tool on the home ribbon here called Format as Table. Now if your window is a different size, Excel's going to compress that ribbon and make things look different, and Format as Table might not be immediately visible. So go ahead and expand that to your whole screen until that option pops up, and it's under Styles here. I'm going to bring this back up. So if I go to Format as Table, I can choose any pretty table I want. I typically like these medium ones here. They tend to provide really eye-catchy segregations and things like that, and it's easier to read. So we'll make this blue and we'll use this guy right here. It already knows where the data is because I've selected it, and my table does have headers, meaning I've indicated categories in the first row. If I didn't, it would create headers, just called column 1, column 2, column 3, that sort of thing. So now I've created a table. And the beautiful thing about Excel tables is that Excel treats them as a named entity, right? So I can pop in here and select table 2 in terms of name entities, and I can now reference that in formulas and more advanced topics we can talk about later. But Excel also, when I want to populate new data in my table, will keep all the same formatting and formulas included in the previous row. So if I said, actually, I conducted a whole bunch of training today, I could copy today's date and let's just put it in a bunch of new rows. Awesome. And I actually trained, 4 people on SOP001. So I also taught Gandalf, the Grey, Gimli, son of Gloin. Oh my goodness, these names. I'm not sure I'm committed to these like I was. Legolas, I don't know his last name. Alright, so those would be the people I trained today, all in 115. And I'll just ditch these extra rows here. And so now I've got a database that is a little bit weird looking. So let's hop over and see, after I've populated a lot of data in this, what it looks like. So as you can see, on several days, I did several different SOPs with several different people. Maybe I do one SOP with several, or I do one person, several SOPs. Doesn't matter, right? I can enter this data in the same way every time. So now I've got this training register, and definitely compared to how we were looking at our matrix, it's hard to immediately pull information out here until we learn some analysis tools, right? So the analysis tool here was learn how to look this way, match them up, and make a determination, right? Here we're having to use some Excel skills, but immediately folks will notice that we've got these drop-down areas. So I can ask the data questions like, what training have I conducted in 2020 or in January 2020? I could filter that and say, what have I done this year or this quarter, things like that. I could say, I want to see everyone has been trained on a particular SOP and when that happened. I could add a second filter and say, how many people have been trained on this SOP in the last 12 months? So I could just filter after a year ago. That would be a way to do that and answer that question. I could also say, I'd love to see all of the training that Bilbo's received. And then, maybe Bilbo just happened to have a GMP failure, so I want to see when the last time he was trained on GMPs was. Okay, that was 1-3, so we're going to include that in our disciplinary actions or in our response to that failure, right? Because he just received that training. So those are the sorts of questions we can start to answer. If Bilbo has received multiple trainings on something, we could see maybe it's June of this year, and so we retrained, and we can see how often we're retraining on these things. But the biggest thing we can do is, besides asking those questions of this data and kind of analyzing that way, is because we've created a nice table database, we can create pivot tables with this. And pivot tables are an extremely powerful tool in Excel that a lot of folks do not use. And if we make good databases, we can use pivots, and pivots are kind of amazing. So I'm going to go ahead and select my table here. We'll go to Insert, and we'll go to Pivot Chart and select Pivot Chart and Pivot Table. We can make just the chart, but it effectively makes the table anyway. So Pivot Chart and Pivot Table. We already selected Table 1. That's this whole table. And we're going to put this in a new worksheet because sharing data with pivot tables causes some weird things to happen. So we always want to put these in new worksheets. I'll hit OK. And you can see that a new worksheet has been created, and I now have a pivot table based on my database. So we'll just help ourselves out here. We'll do training, register, pivot. Beautiful thing about we're not going to use the chart so much as we're going to use the table for this particular piece of analysis, right? Because we don't need a graph representation of training so often. But all of my top columns are now listed here in terms of my pivot table fields. So let's go ahead and populate these out. So filters are going to allow us to filter out fields that have just one or more values in the row. So I could filter by SOP or things like that. Columns are going to be the things that are distributed among the columns, and rows are going to be what's distributed among the rows. The values inside our pivot table are a little bit weird for this one, but effectively we can count every time that particular combination occurred. So if I'm looking back at our matrix and we talked about how easy this was to read, I can quickly create that. So let's go ahead and show me individuals on the columns, just like we had before, so you can see how we populated all those folks up top. And let's go ahead and put the SOPs on the rows. Beautiful. And for the values, let's count every time training has occurred. So as you can see, I've generated the exact same table now. I don't have the recent date on this quite yet, but if I look through my SOPs and I look through my people, I can see that Bilbo was trained on 10.0.0.1 3 times in the history of the table and has never been trained on these particular SOPs. So we can make sure that we cover those gaps. So all those training gaps we identified in this simple chart are now immediately available, along with all of the other information we could potentially pull out of this database, right? If I'm interested in filtering further, I can continue grabbing these fields and duplicate them down here, right? So how about I go ahead and drag training date and we'll put it underneath SOP trained. Now I can see it's created subcategories for each of these SOPs of the years that training actually occurred. And it's got it by year and quarter right now. We can talk about ways to change the way that looks. That'd be right-clicking and hitting group and choosing a different combination of how we want to report things. So maybe instead of quarters, we'll just do year and month. Hey, look, June and December, training occurred in that SOP. Now, they give us these summaries in here, and these are helpful or unhelpful. This is getting busier, but we are getting more information out of it. Maybe instead, I'll actually swap a training date and SOP trained, so we'll actually go by date and then the SOPs. So now, instead of looking at SOP and the months dated, we're looking at the month and the SOPs that were trained that month, right? And let's go ahead and regroup these a little bit. We've got our years popped down there. My bad. There we go. So in 2019 June, we trained on these SOPs and these people were covered, and etc. for the different months. So we're providing a lot of different information here. What I'd maybe rather do is swap that back around. So we'll go back to the way we were viewing that before, and we were looking at SOPs and years, and I'm actually going to go to my row labels for years and just say, let's go after, let's say 1/15/2019. Boom. Now I'm only seeing training that was conducted within 1 year of now. So if I'm coming around to my SQF audit and I want to make sure we're fresh up on training, I've implemented that filter. That's a kind of complicated way of doing that. Instead, maybe let's pop those dates back out. So I've got SOP trained versus people again here. And we'll pop my training date into the filter column, and that way we're not doing a whole bunch of stuff in our rows and keeping the spreadsheet less busy. So show me, I could select if I had more data, this would have years broken out as well. Actually, now that we've got years on here, show me everything that was trained in 2019. Boom. So if we were looking at the past year and things like that, we want to include 2020 because we've already done some training so far this year, but this helps us analyze that. What I'm really getting into is that if we can learn to use these tools and make databases, the rest of this video series is going to show you how to generate reporting and things like that historically has been created by creating these kinds of charts, right? And this is where we get folks who, I can make this start to look professional, I could start filling in some color and things like that so it's easier to read and things like that. But some disadvantages here, I have no training history included in this chart, right? I only have the most recent training that was provided. I don't know how many times I've continued to train people using this chart and things like that. The fact of the matter is, even though I only need to enter in one entry when I want to populate new data, when I only enter one piece of data, I only get one piece of data. in my database, I need to say when we trained, what we trained on, and who it was. And this log of history stays with me so I can follow that stuff. So as we get into more and more programs, we'll talk about building an SOP index using these databasing tools and the advantages gained by that. We'll also talk about how we can build all of our registers. So our product registers, our microbiology specification registers, our audit registers, our corrective actions and findings, our document changes. Anything can be captured in the system and look just as good as a user interface from a third-party piece of software. And at the end of the day, learning that software and inputting all the data will take you the same amount of time. But if we can follow those same rules, we can skip having to buy that system, and we can invest in our employees by teaching these Excel skills that they can then use in other job functions. So hope you found this helpful. We're going to get into we're going to get into video 2 pretty soon here, and we'll start tackling our SOP register and things like that. If you're interested in more of what we got going on, you can always hop back over to furfarmandfork.com, where we're doing analysis and things like that. We also have a lot of posts happening on ifsqn.com regarding document control and some in-depth analysis of individual SQF elements and how we can meet those in audits. If at any point you are interested in these systems but are not sure that your employees have the knowledge to use them and make their Excel stuff more effective, I can also be brought into your company to provide training and help build these systems tailored to your specific company. So you can go to furfarmandfork.com and reach out to me on the consulting link, and we can talk about what that looks like, whether it's on-site or remote. All right, please let me know if you have any questions or anything I can help out with, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day.